Hello. Are ETs Gnostics? Cathar Love 127. Seems like an odd title. And for a lot of people, ETs, extraterrestrials, it's not they believe or don't believe, they've never really gone too much into the subject. But it's a subject that's interested me for certainly more than 30 years. For the simple reason is that I come from Tully, and the guy I went to school with, Ross Panisi, it was on his farm that, or there was a guy on a tractor on his farm, the adjoining farm, and he saw 3 UFOs go overhead. He thought there was something wrong with his tractor. Then he saw them. They were about 30 odd feet in diameter, and he went back from the direction in which they came because they were very low, and he went through the outside of this lagoon, Horseshoe Lagoon, and there you could see where they were nesting or resting, and they were resting on reeds. The reeds had been crumpled in a clockwise or anti-clockwise direction, and they were slowly swirling around. So he went back and saw his neighbour Ross Panisi, and Ross came down and took a camera, photographed it, went right around the world. And but the interesting thing is that in Australia there's been quite a lot of UFO visitations, and certainly around Tully. And my father, who went out there 10 years after the event, because someone asked him, said, look, Harry, he said, I'm really interested in UFOs. He said, is it possible to take me up to Benesi's farm and I can see where they were? And my father said, yeah, I'd like to have a look myself. So I went out there some 10 years later. They stood on the reeds and they were still compressed some 10 years later. So because of these factors, obviously I've taken an interest. And the other thing is, it's probably the, I won't say the greatest question, but certainly it's one of the great questions that scientists and science asks, and the likes of you and I, we ordinary ones, is there life other than on our good planet Earth? And of course extraterrestrials, they show that we are not alone. In Australia it's no big deal writing up about these, the stories, the things that have happened. UFOs down under, it lists, I don't know, well let's have a look. 27 separate incidents, and including 11. Tully farmer finds UFO nest. Interestingly, I did a Google search, which you can do if you wish, and the place, it's outside Tully, T-U-L-L-Y, a little place called Uramo, E-U-R-A-M-O. Now these small towns around Tully were towns taken from places in the First World War. And Uramo is a place in the Middle East. There's another town outside Tully, it's called El Arish, and it's another town outside where the Australian Light Horsemen, not the only cavalry charge in World War One, but the only successful cavalry charge in World War One against machine guns and artillery and so forth, and it was successful. But that's another but interesting story. To digress, my godfather, Bill Kerr, was one of those 800 charging down on the Turks, and he had a bullet which creased him right through the head, so he had a natural part in his hair for the rest of his life. But the thing about Ross, he used to report that to the police, and the police said, look, he went in so often that the police said, look, just, left is really interested, don't come and tell us because we ring up the authorities and they're not really interested. So it's more or less just taken as a matter of course. But in America, in the USA and England, my God, is there a cover-up. Thankfully, there are very smart and brave people who are coming out and discussing these things. And foremost among them, right at the forefront, is Stephen Greer, who, if you look up UFOs or extraterrestrials, you're sure to come across him because he's right at the forefront. But he's put out 2 books, and I have both. First one is Disclosures, where he talks about there's 400 odd people, scientists, politicians, astronauts, ex-CIA, a lot of people from the Air Force, including the Russian Air Force, Italian Air Force, and Japanese pilots. So these people have come out and told their story. In his last book, which has only been out a few months, which I've also picked up in hardcover, as termed Unacknowledged, he talks about the fact that there are now 800 people who are willing to testify. Now, these are not just people who have got a chip on their shoulder. Like the person said about him, he said, oh, he's a very well balanced American. He said, what do you mean by that? He said, because he's got a chip on both shoulders. But he quotes people. I mean, he quotes, well, let's have a look. One I've marked here is by Edgar Mitchell. Now, Edgar Mitchell, as you may or may not know, the Americans would certainly know, he was the 6th astronaut, 6th man to walk on the moon. And an interesting thing, which I discovered in this book, because some people, rightly so, some observant people, and I've noticed it myself once it was pointed out to me, that when they first walked on the moon, the flag waved as if there was a breeze. Now, we know there's no wind on the moon, and so people say it was a setup because of this. Well, they're right, but they did land on the moon. But what happened was, it appears that just in case there could have been problems, they did a bit of an enactment, what might have happened or what it would be like, and so they rigged up this little flag waving thing, and which they popped in. And of course there was the flag moving in the breeze, and which has given rise to a lot of conspiracy theories. So they're both right. That was staged on Earth and put up there, but there was the real landing on the moon. But before, there's this testimonial by Edgar Mitchell, 6th man to walk on the moon. But the thing about it is that with all this information coming to us, and some information has also come from extraterrestrials, because they've left messages. But the one thing, and I include crop circles and messages on the crop circles, mainly in England but all around the world, including Australia, is that they want us to move into a state of higher consciousness or higher spirituality. They want us to go into space as a civilized race. And Stephen Greer puts it quite eloquently. As I've stated in the introduction, the extraterrestrials, ETs, have made it very clear that the entry ticket for human civilization to become interplanetary is first and foremost to be civilized, to live together peacefully, to renounce weapons of mass destruction, to go out into space free of weapon systems with a consciousness of universal peace. sounds a bit Gnostic to me. So, I just mentioned something from Edgar Mitchell, and who's the sixth astronaut. So he says it as it is. Yes, there has been ET visitations. There have been crashed craft. There have been materials and bodies recovered. And there is some group of people somewhere that may or may not be associated with the government at this point, but certainly were at one time. They have this knowledge. They have been attempting to conceal this knowledge, will not permit it to be widely disseminated. I cannot answer who these people are, but there is a lot of evidence that points to what I call a clandestine group, people who have some quasi-affiliation with the government and certain government facilities, but operate in a very stealthy and secret way that is not generally under high-level government control, as far as I can tell. There has been a certain amount of reverse engineering that has allowed some of these craft, or some of the components, to be duplicated. And yes, there are earthlings who are utilising some of this equipment in a certain way. So, this is Edgar Mitchell. Just turning the page, there's a testimonial from Don Phillips, US Air Force contractor at Lockheed Skunk Works. And the CIA worked with Kelly Johnson at the Lockheed Skunk Works on design and construction of the U-2 near CR-71 Blackbird. He says, and he's not the only one in the book to say this, during the Apollo landing, Neil Armstrong says, "They are here." These are the actual first words he uttered. And there's a cut-off, and because the system of what they were doing, they could cut off and any part of the communication. But unfortunately, fortunately, there were other people taking these transmissions, and they did hear what Neil Armstrong actually said, which is what I'm saying now. They're here. They're right over there, and look at the size of those ships. And it's obvious they don't like us being here. He went on to describe a lineup of military planes. Only here are these craft and their people observing them. Neil Armstrong said, "They don't want us to be here." Enough. But it's a great book, and it tells you of things that are quite amazing and some things that are quite sad. But it's good news, because both people here who have been in those ICBM, with the nuclear warheads and missiles, and they've had UFOs, and they've been closed down, and they've been absolutely and totally closed down. Now, that's in the USA, but you also have there a Russian retired Air Force colonel who actually was ordered to chase UFOs, and when he went to press and fire at the USO, he blanked out, and when he came to, his jet was well past the UFO, so he didn't actually press the button to fire. But he says the same thing, that there's been those silos in Russia with the nuclear warheads, and the UFOs have closed them down. The other thing is, and which they speak about on a number of occasions, because this one person said to me, a dear friend, if the UFOs are around, why don't they land in Sydney Harbour and everyone will know, and then there's no argument? But I said, they've done that. Where? I said, in Washington. It was in 1952 in July. This is the time of when Kennedy and Khrushchev were having a big fight over the rockets going to Cuba. And on a number of nights, and they were there for a period of hours altogether, in July 1952, and you can look it up, you can Google it, and there's the Washington Post, the New York Times, and other newspapers with photographs and showing it, and also that people took videos of it, or movies of it. There's no videos then, and you can see that, and there's tens of thousands of witnesses. So, I mean, it's a pretty obvious situation, and there was more or less like 9 UFOs, and they were in formation, and they were just moving slowly past, and so they are out to make their presence felt. But what happens is, and sad to say, my father came down to Sydney, and we visited my uncle Len, who was a science teacher, science master at Sydney Grammar. And in fact, at the Sydney University, there's a campus named after him, and it's called Besser College. His name was Len Besser. A delightful person, very knowledgeable, smart. But he said to my father, because obviously he knew my father came from Tully, and Tully was where the UFOs were supposed to have landed. And he said to Harry, he said, "What do you think about the UFOs?" And my father just said, "Oh, well, I don't know." He said, "Really?" But he said, "I do know." He told the story that I said earlier on, that he went out there and he stood on the area, and the reeds were still all compacted, and he mentioned Ross Panizzi and Pedley and seeing the UFOs. But my father said to Ross Panizzi, he said, "Ross, have you seen any UFOs?" He said, "Harry, I have seen so many. I've been into the police so often, the police have said, don't come here anymore." He said, "Unless it's something really unusual." He said, it just got to the point that we saw sightings quite often. But as I said, on Google, you can Google Horseshoe Lagoon, Euramo, E-U-R-A-M-O, and of course Google Maps don't change all the time, and if you look down there, you can see, right, follow the road, and just alongside the lagoon, you can actually see on Google Maps, you can see these little UFO nests, and there's a few around there as well, not just the one. So, my uncle Len, and he said, "So what do you think about the UFOs?" My father replied about what happened. "Oh," he said, Harry, it's called ufology, you know, UFO fools." He said, it's all a joke, it's all ridiculous, and it was a bit embarrassing for my father, because my father's not going to argue against a guy who teaches science. So I was a bit disappointed in him, but apart from that, he was quite a delightful person. So there's a guy teaching science at Sydney Grammar who says it's in your imagination. Well, my father stood on the place, was there, so they're there. Now, I've not had the pleasure to see any UFOs myself. I look up at the sky every so often, but they've eluded me so far. But people who are very close to me, one couple, they were in there having, this is going back about 20 years ago, and they were in their lounge, which also was their dining room, and this very, very bright light outside, and they looked at it casually at both of them. Then they decided, what the hell's going on? What's going out there? So they went out and looked, and here was this UFO sitting outside. Been looking at them for something like 3/4 of an hour, or certainly half an hour, while they were eating their meal. And when it did, and it took off, and it went around the side of the block of units, and they rushed into the bathroom, and they just saw it take off. So that's one instance. The other instance was, and this person only told me a few weeks ago, and it happened to them, it would be probably 25 years ago. And it was an afternoon, warm, and this person, they're actually at acting school, and there was a break. That person went out to school, out to the car, just to have a rest, and closed the eyes, and just happened to open it, and here was this grey, I presume, because it wasn't big, but there was this head looking through the windscreen, the front windscreen, and just looking at her. And she got a fright. Ah! It took off, it ran off. But she said, there I was, just looking at her, and nothing, just looking at her, but she just got such a fright. There are so many people who've had experiences, but the people want to ridicule people, and ridicule it's a great way to shut people up, because none of us want to be considered fools. There's a few of us who've got to that ripe old age where we don't care. We know we're not fools, we know we're not stupid, and that people want to call us idiots and so forth. Well, that's okay, because it's not my problem. That's that person's problem and that person's point of view, and what have you. But it's a good subject that needs to come out, and it is coming out, because these books, hundreds of thousands of people have seen it now, and it's on YouTube, so you don't have to read book. You can look up the disclosure or the unacknowledged, Stephen Greer. Very interesting, and you can see each thing is supported, whatever they do say, is supported by written testimonials. Now, are ETs Gnostic? Well, from what we can gather, and what it seems apparent, that they've been visiting Earth for thousands of years, and not just Earth, other planets. They've certainly worked out space-time, and they can move from, it appears, odd dimensions, because people who've seen them, and this is the military and so forth, they're seeing them and then they just disappear, and then in a blink of an eye they're 1,000 miles away, somewhere down the coast, and because they can see these on the radar. And this has happened hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. So Christianity is 2,000 years old. Buddhism arrived some 500 years after that, and so did Islam. So before that you have Judaism, which goes back long before the time of Christ. And we go even right back to the Sumerians. But if we check on the Sumerian culture, you will find that on a number of occasions they've certainly got, which are quite obviously UFOs, and they've depicted them because they're no different to what the modern craft are. So they're certainly there in Sumeria. Some have said that they have cohabited, they've had sexual relations with humans, and that's aided us in our smart development. So maybe we should call some of those extraterrestrials Adam and Eve. I don't know, but these are conjectures, and it's more likely to be true than the biblical Adam and Eve and that story. But there is a situation, because people are looking for the missing link, and the missing link, it's the difference between the pro-hominoid, where obviously the heavier ridged skulls and a different type of skull, and there you can see there's a progression of skulls that they've got, but there's nothing between them and our skull. Rather than think about the skull, it's easier to think about the rib cage, because the pro-hominoid rib cage is pointy and comes down like an inverted heart. Now our rib cage is quite the opposite. It's round and comes round, and it's quite oval. So very, very, very distinct species. So there's been some, so there's supposed to be the missing link, which hasn't been found, that bridges these two types of hominoids, the modern and the previous type. So just maybe there was some extraterrestrial intervention, and who knows, maybe that's the missing link. But the fact that they were around for so long, and long before Islam, Christianity and Judaism, that rules them out. Scientology doesn't even get a look in. So all that is left, really, of the philosophies that go back, that are pre-Christian, is Gnosticism. Now Gnosticism, to be a Gnostic, at its most basic, is simply you are taking personal responsibility for your own mind, body and soul. So you're taking responsibility for your health of your soul, and the health of your spirituality, and the health of your body. You don't need an imam, a sheikh, a priest, a rabbi, a cardinal or a bishop, a minister, patriarch, anyone between you and the divine. This is a Gnostic. And the other thing is, Gnostics, the one rule for Gnosticism is that you think for yourself. You listen to people, you listen to teachers, listen to anybody, listen to me if you want. But you just take in what they say, and then with reasoning and comprehension and intelligence, you come to your own conclusion, your own decisions, and also this is obviously intermingled with your own life experiences, and between that you come to your own philosophical or spiritual conclusions. In other words, you're seeking knowledge of what's really going on rather than what someone has told you or written about. This is Gnosticism. And the other aspect of Gnosticism is that we just don't have one life. There's reincarnation, or we have a continuum of lives. We keep reincarnating until such time that we, I hope, that we no longer have to reincarnate, and then we can come back from whence we came, with the source or the origin or the creator. So this is Gnosticism. So I'm sure that the extraterrestrials, and there's been a number of races. The United Nations, I think, have already delineated some 6 extraterrestrial races. The tall Nordic Greys, the tall Nordic Blondes, we know about them, and we know about which often some of the crashes in Roswell and different places. We've had the small Greys, and they're about 4 foot. So they can't belong to the great face simply because of the time factor. But if they are people that have been taught to think for themselves, they are beings that are taught to take control of their own spirituality. There are beings that believe that there was a source, an origin of all things, that ultimately there had to be some point where things were created. That's pretty Gnostic to me. And the other thing is, if they believe in reincarnation, that at some point they may live for 500 years, but ultimately they will die, and then once that body is cast aside, our soul, our divine spark, continues on and moves into another body, be it an earth-type body, an earthling-type body, or some other extraterrestrial body. Same thing, it doesn't matter. So, I don't know if the extraterrestrials, ETs, are Gnostic, but if they do have a philosophy And it's a civilized philosophy where we give everybody equality, male, female, or in between. We are loving towards all species, loving towards the environment, the celestial environment, the cosmos, not just our own planet. If we try to do good, and certainly they're not trying to do us any harm, because if they wanted to harm us, they could have harmed us on many occasions, and certainly they wouldn't wait until now we're becoming, our weapons are becoming more sophisticated. If the extraterrestrials were intended to harm us, they could have done it 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 1,000 years ago. So this just logically is out of the question. But they want a peaceful universe. Lots of us want a peaceful universe, a peaceful cosmos. And there's only a very small group of people within this world who want to take control and power for themselves, an elite. And they're not very nice people. But most of us, and it doesn't matter what race or religion we are, most of us are looking for goodness and kindness and tolerance and respect. So in that case, which is all part of being Gnostic. So if the ETs do have a particular philosophy, I'm closer then, and it's a civilized and spiritual philosophy, then of all things that we have on earth, it's most likely that will be closer to Gnosticism than anything else. Bye for now. Nice to talk to you.